When the Night Lords descend on a world, history records the screaming. The flayed skins hung as banners, the cities reduced to charnel houses. But someone had to sharpen those flaying knives. Someone had to drag the bodies into position for maximum psychological impact. Someone had to scrub the blood from the deck plating so the next batch of victims wouldn't slip. The 8th Legion didn't operate in a vacuum. They required hands to prepare their atrocities. Mortal hands that belonged to people who once had names, families, lives that meant something before they were reduced to tools in service of terror. These weren't space marines. They weren't even proper soldiers. They were thralls, human serfs bound to the most brutal legion the Imperium ever fielded. And their existence reveals something the chronicles of the Horus heresy rarely acknowledge: that the machinery of catastrophic violence requires maintenance, and maintenance requires laborers who must live with what they enable. The Night Lord's Legion recruited its thralls differently than other Astartes legions. Where the Ultramarines drew their chapter serfs from families who served for generations, pride in service passed down through bloodlines, the 8th Legion acquired theirs through conquest and coercion. When a world fell to the Night Lords, survivors weren't simply executed or abandoned. Some were selected, not the strongest, not the most defiant. Those died in the initial assaults, their deaths designed to break the will of everyone watching. The Thralls were chosen from those who witnessed the terror campaigns and survived. People who understood exactly what their new masters were capable of because they had watched friends and relatives suffer demonstration killings meant to teach lessons about disobedience. Selection wasn't random. The Night Lords needed specific skills. Ship maintenance required technical knowledge, void-born workers who understood plasma drives and Geller field generators, people who could keep ancient vessels operational without access to Mechanicus support. Medical knowledge was valuable, even if Thrall Medici could never repair Astartes' physiology. They treated each other, maintained the apothecarium equipment, prepared surgical theaters before the apothecaries arrived. Scribes were needed to maintain ship logs, inventory munitions, track supply lines during extended campaigns, far from Imperial logistics networks. And then there were the handlers, individuals with strong stomachs and absolute obedience, who prepared torture chambers and disposed of what remained afterward. The distinction between thrall and slave wasn't always clear. Imperial propaganda insisted that chapter serfs served willingly, honored by their proximity to the Emperor's angels of death. For most legions, this contained some truth. Thralls raised within the legion's culture genuinely believed in their purpose. But the Night Lords operated differently. Their thralls understood they were property. Escape meant death, not simply for the individual, but for everyone associated with them. Conrad Kurz's 8th Legion had refined the mathematics of collective punishment long before the heresy began. If one thrall attempted desertion during a planetary assault, their entire deck section would be selected for an example. Not immediate execution. That would be insufficient. The demonstration had to teach a lesson about the futility of hope. This created a self-regulating system. Thralls policed each other because individual rebellion endangered everyone. If someone began showing signs of defiance, speaking too freely, questioning orders, expressing sympathy for victims, their fellow thralls would report them before the Night Lords noticed. Better one person suffer than an entire compartment. This wasn't loyalty to the Legion. This was survival mathematics, the cold calculus that develops in any population living under systematic terror. The Night Lords understood this and encouraged it. They didn't need their thralls to love them. fear was more reliable than devotion. Life aboard a Night Lord's vessel followed rhythms dictated by operational necessity rather than human comfort. Ship time operated on 18-hour cycles, broken into work periods, and mandatory rest. Thralls slept in communal barracks, bare metal bunks stacked 3 high. Personal space measured in the width of a sleeping roll. Privacy didn't exist. Neither did warmth. The 8th Legion kept their vessels cold, environmental systems calibrated for Astartes' physiology that processed temperature extremes without discomfort. For baseline humans, this meant constant chill, bodies never quite warm enough, the kind of cold that settled into bones and made everything ache. Food arrived on schedule, nutritional paste dispensed from bulk processors. It contained everything required for human survival: protein chains, vitamins, minerals, and nothing that made eating pleasurable. Taste was irrelevant. Color was absent. The paste carried a faint metallic aftertaste that never quite disappeared. Some thralls tried to supplement their rations with whatever they could scavenge, but opportunities were limited. Fresh food was reserved for Astartes' consumption, and stealing from Legion supplies meant public execution. A few thralls maintained small fungal gardens in forgotten maintenance tunnels, cultivating protein sources in the dark. This was technically forbidden, but generally ignored as long as it didn't interfere with operations. Work assignments varied by skill set and current operational needs. During void transit between systems, maintenance dominated. Every system aboard a vessel required constant attention. Plasma reactors needed monitoring. Water recyclers accumulated biological waste that had to be manually cleared. Air filtration systems developed blockages that only human hands could reach. The work was endless, because the ships themselves were ancient, some dating back to the Great Crusade's early decades, layered with modifications and repairs that made their internal architecture a labyrinth of contradictory systems. Thralls learned the ships through experience, memorizing routes through passages too cramped for Astartes, knowing which corridors to avoid when certain legionaries were off duty. When the fleet reached a target world, the work changed. Assault preparations required different labor. Drop pods needed loading with munitions and supplies. Boarding torpedoes required maintenance checks. Equipment had to be distributed to squads according to the tactical plan, if there was one. The Night Lords operated with less formal organization than other legions, captains commanding their companies with broad autonomy. This meant thralls sometimes received contradictory orders from different Astartes, creating situations where satisfying one master meant angering another. These situations were dangerous. The solution involved careful social navigation, understanding which Night Lords would punish direct disobedience versus which ones respected initiative, learning personalities through observation. The most dreaded assignments involved preparing the terror weapons. The Night Lords employed psychological warfare as their primary strategic tool. This required preparation. Flayed skins had to be preserved with chemical treatments to prevent decay during display. Recording equipment needed positioning to capture screaming at optimal fidelity for later broadcast. Bodies required arrangement in patterns calculated to maximize horror. Children separated from parents. Families positioned so the living could watch the dying. Thralls performed this work under direct supervision. The Night Lords wanted specific results, and failure meant joining the display. Not all thralls occupied the same social position within the Legion structure. A hierarchy existed, informal but recognized, based on proximity to power and relative safety. At the top sat the bridge crew, thralls who served directly under the ship's captain and senior officers. These positions offered certain protections. A thrall who understood the vessel's navigation systems or managed communications arrays possessed functional value that made arbitrary execution wasteful. They still lived in constant danger, but their skills provided a buffer against casual violence. Medici thralls occupied a similar tier. Though they couldn't treat Astartes' injuries, they maintained the apothecarium equipment and assisted during procedures. When a Night Lord required surgical intervention after battle damage, the apothecary needed instruments prepared, anesthetics measured, biological samples processed. Thralls performed this work, and competence was noticed. An efficient Medici thrall might serve for decades, aging into seniority, while younger thralls around them died from accidents or executions. Below this tier were the technical specialists, plasma reactor technicians, weapons engineers, void suit maintenance crews. They possessed skills that couldn't be easily replaced. Training a new thrall to understand ancient mechanisms took time, and the Night Lords, despite their brutality, understood resource management. Killing a skilled technician meant either operating with degraded systems or investing time in training a replacement. Neither option was appealing during extended campaigns. These thralls experienced relative stability, though stability was always conditional. The middle tiers contained the general laborers, thralls assigned to cleaning, cargo management, food preparation, basic maintenance. Their work required minimal specialized knowledge, making them interchangeable. A laborer who angered a legionary could be executed and replaced within hours by someone else from the population. This vulnerability created its own social dynamics. Laborers formed alliances, watching each other's backs, sharing information about which Astartes were currently in foul moods, which areas of the ship to avoid during certain hours. At the bottom existed the disposables, thralls assigned to the torture chambers and terror preparation. They handled the victims, operated the equipment, cleaned up afterward. These positions carried the highest mortality rate, not from execution, but from proximity to the work itself. The psychological damage was cumulative. Some thralls lasted months, others broke within weeks, collapsing into catatonia or attempting suicide. The Night Lords replaced them without comment. There was always another laborer who could be reassigned to the chambers, always someone else who could learn to prepare the flaying frames. This hierarchy wasn't official. No charts existed mapping thrall social structure, but everyone understood their position relative to everyone else. A bridge thrall didn't speak to a torture chamber attendant unless necessity demanded it. Skilled technicians received better bunk assignments, marginal improvements in their living conditions that marked status. These distinctions might seem trivial to outsiders, but aboard a Night Lord's vessel, any improvement in conditions represented significant advantage. An extra hour of sleep, a bunk near a heat duct, access to a private washing station. These were privileges that could mean the difference between maintaining sanity and losing it. New thralls arrived traumatized from whatever conquest had produced them. The Night Lords didn't bother with formal orientation. You learned through observation and survival. The first days determined who would adapt and who would die. Some new arrivals refused to accept their situation, clinging to the belief that rescue would come, that the Imperium would send forces to liberate them. These individuals didn't last long. The Night Lords had no patience for hope. It was crushed systematically through demonstration. A common method involved forced observation. New thralls would be brought to witness interrogations. Not to participate, they weren't ready for that, but simply to watch. The Night Lords were artists of pain. and their work was designed to communicate specific lessons. The victim's identity didn't matter. Sometimes it was a captured enemy soldier. Sometimes it was another Thrall who had violated regulations. The point wasn't justice or information extraction. The point was education. New Thralls watched as someone screamed for hours, watched as the apothecaries kept them conscious through medical intervention that prevented shock, watched as death became something they begged for. After several of these sessions, the new Thralls understood their position. They weren't people anymore. They were tools that would be maintained as long as they remained useful and discarded when they broke. This understanding settled differently in different minds. Some collapsed into depression, going through motions mechanically until they made a fatal error or simply stopped eating. Others adapted, finding ways to construct meaning within the constraints. They focused on survival, building routines, establishing small zones of control in an otherwise chaotic existence. The Night Lords reinforced compliance through unpredictability. If punishments followed consistent patterns, Thralls could avoid them through behavioral adjustment. But the 8th Legion understood that randomness created more effective fear. Sometimes a mistake was overlooked. Sometimes it resulted in execution. Sometimes the punishment fell on someone else entirely. This prevented Thralls from developing stable expectations. You could never be certain that following regulations guaranteed safety, which meant anxiety became constant. Collective punishment remained a favored tool. When Thrall efficiency dropped below acceptable levels, the Night Lords would select a compartment for demonstration. The selection wasn't based on actual responsibility. It was random, or appeared random. Everyone in the compartment would be assembled. One individual would be chosen, brought forward, and executed in front of the others. Skinned alive, burned, vivisected, whatever method the presiding Astartes deemed appropriate. The rest would be forced to watch. Afterward, they would return to work. Efficiency would improve, not because anyone understood what they had done wrong, but because everyone was terrified of being chosen next time. This created a population that never relaxed. Even during rest periods, sleep came fitfully. Dreams were filled with scenarios of being selected, of making the wrong error at the wrong moment. Thralls developed various coping mechanisms. Some turned to religion, praying to the Emperor in private, building small shrines in forgotten corners of the ship. The Night Lords generally ignored this as long as it didn't interfere with operations. Other Thralls formed tight social bonds, creating surrogate families within the barracks. These relationships were dangerous. Caring about someone made you vulnerable, but they provided psychological anchoring that kept some individuals functional. Despite their brutality, the Night Lords depended on their Thralls more than they acknowledged. A battle barge required thousands of crew to operate. Astartes handled combat operations, strategic planning, tactical execution. But the mundane necessities of keeping a vessel operational fell to mortal hands. The environmental systems needed monitoring every 8 hours. Plasma reactors required daily diagnostics. Navigation calculations during warp transit demanded constant adjustment. Food preparation, waste management, equipment maintenance. These tasks consumed hours of labor that Astartes didn't have time for. This dependency created a strange dynamic. The Night Lords needed their Thralls functional, which meant they couldn't kill them all. Mass executions had to be calculated to maximize fear while maintaining operational capacity. If a captain executed too many Thralls in a demonstration, his vessel would suffer degraded performance. Other Night Lords would notice. Conrad Kurz had built the 8th Legion on a foundation of terror, but he also demanded results. Ships that couldn't maintain their systems because their captains had killed too many crew members would be viewed as failures. Thralls learned to exploit this dynamic carefully. Direct defiance was suicide, but subtle resistance was possible. A technician could repair a system slowly, stretching a 4-hour job into 6 hours without it appearing deliberate. Maintenance logs could be adjusted to make problems seem more complex than they were. These acts of quiet sabotage provided small measures of agency in an existence defined by powerlessness. They were dangerous. Discovery meant horrific death, but they were also necessary for maintaining some sense of self. The Night Lords weren't stupid. They recognized that their thralls engaged in minor resistance. Some ignored it because the impact was negligible, and rooting it out would require effort that could be directed elsewhere. Others turned it into a game, watching for signs of deliberate slowdowns, occasionally catching a thrall in an act of sabotage and making an example. This kept the rest nervous, uncertain whether their small rebellions had been noticed. A few thralls went further. Actual sabotage, the kind that could cripple systems or create opportunities for escape, was rare, but not unknown. These attempts almost always failed. The Night Lords had been conducting terror campaigns for decades before the heresy began. They understood how prisoners thought, how desperate people behaved. Vessels had internal security systems designed to detect tampering. Watch schedules ensured that critical systems were never completely unsupervised. And the culture of mutual surveillance among thralls meant that whispers of a sabotage plan often reached Astartes' ears before the act could be attempted. When sabotage was discovered, the punishment was theatrical. The responsible thralls, and everyone associated with them, would be gathered in a central location, usually a cargo bay large enough to hold hundreds. The saboteurs would be brought forward. What followed depended on the captain's mood and the severity of the sabotage. Sometimes it was quick, a bolt pistol round to the head for each perpetrator. More often, it was prolonged. The 8th Legion specialized in making death last, in stretching the final moments into hours. The assembled thralls would watch. They would hear the screaming. They would understand once again that resistance was futile. When the Night Lords deployed to a target world, the Thrall experience changed dramatically. Shipboard routines broke down, replaced by the chaos of active military operations. Thralls who normally maintained environmental systems found themselves reassigned to loading drop pods. Medici staff prepared field surgical stations in cargo holds. Everyone worked longer hours, sleep deprivation accumulating until exhaustion became a permanent state. Some thralls accompanied landing forces. Not as combatants, the Night Lords didn't waste equipment on mortal auxiliaries, but as support personnel. They carried supplies, operated communications equipment, set up field command posts. This was extraordinarily dangerous. Imperial defenders didn't distinguish between Astartes and the mortals serving them. A thrall on a battlefield was a target, and unlike Space Marines, they wore no power armor. A single lasgun shot could kill them. Casualties during planetary assaults were high. Thralls died from enemy fire, from accidents, from being in the wrong place when a building collapsed or a munitions dump exploded. The Night Lords made no effort to protect them beyond basic tactical sense. Losing all your support personnel was inefficient. But if a Thrall's death served a purpose, distraction, or bait, or simply filling a gap in the battle line, the Legion employed them without hesitation. Survivors returned to the ships changed. Watching Astartes commit atrocities from the safety of a vessel was one form of horror. Being present on the ground, helping prepare the apparatus of terror, standing meters away when the screaming started. That was different. Some Thralls broke completely after their first deployment, retreating into catatonia or becoming violent toward themselves or others. These individuals were quietly executed or recycled into servitor components if the ship's tech priest had need of raw material. Others adapted through dissociation. They learned to separate the work from themselves, constructing internal narratives that allowed them to perform tasks without processing their moral weight. I'm just following orders. I'm not the one doing the killing. If I don't do this, they'll kill me and find someone else who will. These rationalizations were simultaneously true and insufficient. They kept people functional. They didn't address the cumulative psychological damage. Between deployments, during transit through the warp, the ships became pressure vessels of accumulated trauma. Thralls who had witnessed atrocities worked alongside Thralls who had participated in them. Everyone carrying memories they couldn't discuss, because speaking about what they'd seen or done made it real in new ways. Silence became the default mode of interaction. People worked together for years without learning each other's names, without asking about their lives before the Legion, because those conversations opened doors that were safer left closed. Thrall populations aboard Night Lord's vessels included multiple generations. Women gave birth in the Medici bays, their pregnancies monitored by Thrall physicians who worked with whatever resources were available. Infant mortality was high. Conditions aboard the vessels, poor nutrition, environmental toxins, constant stress, made pregnancy dangerous. Many children were stillborn or died within their first standard year. Those who survived grew up inside the nightmare. They never knew any other existence. For them, the Night Lords weren't invaders who had destroyed their worlds. They were simply the reality of existence. These children learned to walk in the corridors of murder ships, learned to speak by overhearing Thralls discuss atrocities, learned what behavior was acceptable by watching executions. The Night Lords had no use for children too young to work, but they didn't kill them systematically. Children represented future labor, potential Thralls, who would require no breaking-in period because they had been conditioned from birth. By the time these children reached working age, usually around 10 or 11 standard years, they understood the rules. They knew which passages to avoid. They knew never to look directly at an Astartes. They knew that crying was dangerous because it drew attention. Some Thralls tried to protect the children, to create small spaces of normalcy. They told stories, fragments of remembered worlds before the Night Lords came. They taught basic reading and mathematics, skills that might improve a child's value, and thus their chances of survival. These efforts were limited by exhaustion and resources, but they represented attempts to preserve something human in an environment designed to crush humanity. The Night Lords tolerated this up to a point. A completely broken population couldn't function efficiently. Thralls needed enough psychological cohesion to perform complex tasks, which meant allowing some social structures to exist. But there were limits. If a Thrall became too attached to a child, formed a bond that might motivate, resistance, the Night Lords would notice. The child might be reassigned to a different section of the ship, or they might be selected for a demonstration. Either way, the lesson was clear. Don't care too much about anyone. Children born aboard the vessels were sometimes recruited into different roles. The apothecaries occasionally took an interest in a child showing unusual intelligence or manual dexterity, training them as surgical assistants. These positions were prestigious by Thrall standards, offering relative safety and better conditions. But they required the child to participate in the Legion's medical procedures. which included vivisection of prisoners and experimental augmentation. The training destroyed whatever innocence remained. By adulthood, these second-generation Thralls were in some ways more damaged than those who had been captured from conquered worlds. They had no baseline of normalcy to remember, no prior life that could serve as evidence that existence didn't have to be this way. For them, the horror was simply reality, and the question of whether life should be different never formed. When Horus raised his banner against the Emperor, the Night Lords joined the rebellion without hesitation. Conrad Kersey had long since abandoned any pretense of loyalty to the Imperium's ideals. For the Thralls, the distinction between loyal and traitor legions was abstract. Their lives didn't change immediately. The work continued. The terror campaigns continued. The only difference was that now the targets included Imperial worlds that had previously been off-limits. As the heresy progressed, conditions deteriorated. Supply lines broke down. The Night Lords operated as raiders, but raiding didn't provide everything a void-going fleet required. Food stocks dwindled. Medical supplies ran out. Replacement parts for critical systems became impossible to acquire. Thralls improvised, cannibalizing non-essential systems to keep essential ones functional. But the situation spiraled into slow collapse. The warp itself became more dangerous. Without stable navigation and reliable astropaths, transit through the immaterium carried higher risks. Ships emerged from the warp in wrong locations, missing scheduled rendezvous. Some vessels disappeared entirely, lost to warp storms or demonic incursion. For the Thralls aboard these ships, the final moments must have been incomprehensible horror as reality itself dissolved. On vessels that survived, discipline among the Night Lords began to fracture. The Legion had always operated with loose cohesion, individual captains exercising broad autonomy. During the heresy, this decentralization intensified. Some captains pursued personal vendettas against specific Imperial commanders. Others descended into pure sadism, conducting terror raids with no strategic purpose beyond inflicting suffering. A few attempted to maintain some version of military order, but these efforts were undermined by the general collapse of command structure. For Thralls, this meant increased danger and uncertainty. A captain who maintained discipline, even brutal discipline, was predictable. You could learn his patterns, understand what behavior would avoid punishment. But a captain losing control was random, capable of executing a dozen Thralls on a whim, or conducting elaborate torture sessions because he was bored. Some Thralls attempted transfer to different vessels, requesting reassignment to ships whose captains seemed more stable. But these requests were rarely granted. The arrival of Chaos worship added another layer of nightmare. Some Night Lords embraced the ruinous powers, not out of genuine belief, but because it offered power and immortality. These warriors underwent transformations, their bodies warping into new configurations. For Thralls who had to serve them, the horror magnified. A Space Marine was already a superhuman monster. A Space Marine touched by chaos became something else entirely. Not all Night Lords turned to chaos. Many rejected it on principle, viewing warp taint as weakness or corruption that undermined their identity. But even these legionaries operated in an increasingly chaotic environment. Demonic entities manifested aboard ships during warp transit. Reality became unstable in certain compartments. Thralls working in affected areas sometimes disappeared, their fates unknown, but easily imagined. Across decades of service, Thralls who survived developed sophisticated psychological adaptations. Dissociation was common, the ability to perform horrific tasks while mentally separating the action from the self. A Thrall could prepare torture equipment, assist in flaying procedures, dispose of bodies, all while maintaining internal narrative that they were not responsible, that their hands were tools being operated by some external force. Compartmentalization allowed Thralls to separate their existence into boxes. Work was one box, sealed away during rest periods. Relationships were another box, opened carefully and only with people deemed trustworthy. Memories of life before the Night Lords were locked in the deepest box, visited rarely because the contrast with present reality was unbearable. Some Thralls constructed elaborate internal philosophies to justify their cooperation. They told themselves they were reducing suffering by performing tasks efficiently, that if they didn't do the work, someone less skilled would, and that might make things worse. These rationalizations were self-deception, but they were necessary self-deception, allowing people to continue functioning in situations that would otherwise break them completely. Religion provided comfort for some. Despite the Night Lord's contempt for the Imperial Creed, many Thralls maintained private faith. They prayed in hidden corners, built small shrines from salvaged materials, whispered hymns during work the Emperor's. Protection seemed absent, but belief itself offered psychological structure. It provided framework for understanding suffering as temporary, as test that might eventually end. Others abandoned faith entirely, concluding that no benevolent God would permit their circumstances. These Thralls adopted nihilistic philosophies, deciding that existence had no inherent meaning, and that survival was its own justification. This perspective could be oddly liberating. If nothing mattered, then the horrors they witnessed or participated in were simply events without moral weight. Social bonds, despite their danger, remained crucial. Thralls formed partnerships, usually with people who worked similar schedules or bunked nearby. These relationships weren't deep. Vulnerability was too risky, but they provided basic human connection. Someone to watch your back during work. Someone to share information about which Night Lords were currently dangerous. Someone to sit beside in silence during rest periods. Presence itself offering reassurance that you hadn't ceased to be human. A few Thralls maintained hope of escape. They gathered information about Imperial fleet movements, memorized potential routes through the warp, hoarded supplies that might support independent survival. These preparations were nearly always futile. Escaping a Night Lord's vessel was virtually impossible, and even if successful, where would you go? Most Thralls were marked by their service, psychologically damaged in ways that would never heal. But maintaining the possibility of escape, however remote, provided some Thralls with reason to continue. Every Thrall aboard a Night Lord's vessel faced the same impossible moral question. At what point did survival through cooperation become complicity in atrocity? The question had no good answer. Refusal meant death. Cooperation meant participating, even indirectly, in horrific acts. Some Thralls rationalized their choice through necessity. Dead, they could help no one, including themselves. Alive, they might eventually find opportunity to resist or escape. But this rationalization grew weaker with time and accumulated acts. A Thrall who prepared the flaying chamber once could claim they had no choice. A Thrall who had done it 100 times had to confront harder questions. The routine nature of the work created its own horror. This wasn't singular trauma, but systematic participation in evil. And unlike the Night Lords themselves, who were conditioned from transformation into remorseless killers. Thralls retained enough humanity to recognize what they were doing. Some Thralls drew personal lines, boundaries they wouldn't cross, even if it meant death. They would perform maintenance work, but refused assignments involving direct interaction with victims. When forced into such situations, they might deliberately perform poorly, finding ways to shorten suffering even by seconds. These small acts of resistance came at enormous personal risk. The Night Lords noticed inefficiency, and punishment followed. But for some Thralls, maintaining any moral boundary was psychologically necessary, proof to themselves that they hadn't become complete instruments of evil. Others abandoned such distinctions, concluding that drawing lines was self-deception. If you maintained the ship that transported the Night Lords to their targets, you were already complicit. If you fed the legionaries who committed the atrocities, you were complicit. If you continued breathing while serving them, you were complicit. This conclusion led different people in different directions. Some became more efficient, deciding that if they were already damned, they might as well optimize their survival. Others looked for opportunities to sabotage, accepting that they were complicit, but trying to reduce the scale of harm. The psychological toll was cumulative and permanent. Thralls who somehow escaped their service, through rescue, or the death of their masters, or the rare success of an escape attempt, carried the weight of what they had done or enabled. They couldn't reintegrate into normal imperial society. The memories prevented it. The knowledge of what they had participated in prevented it. Many former Thralls chose isolation, settling on remote worlds where they wouldn't have to explain their past or face judgment from people who couldn't understand the impossible choices survival had required. As the heresy collapsed and the traitor legions fled into the Eye of Terror, the Night Lords splintered completely. Some warbands maintained their ships and continued raiding Imperial space. Others descended into warp-corrupted madness. A few captains attempted to establish power bases in the eastern fringe, claiming territories far from Terra's direct control. For the Thralls aboard these vessels, the post-heresy period brought no improvement. If anything, conditions worsened. Resources became even scarcer. Prey worlds had been devastated by years of warfare, offering little to raiders. The Night Lords turned on each other, company fighting company over salvage and territory. Thralls caught in these internal conflicts had no stake in the outcome. They would serve whoever won. But they died anyway, caught in crossfire or executed by victorious warbands who didn't want to maintain excess population. Some Thralls were abandoned. When a Night Lord's warband dissolved or its ship became too damaged to repair, the Astartes might take a smaller vessel and depart, leaving the Thralls to die aboard the crippled ship. A few managed to jury-rig systems enough to limp to inhabited worlds. Arriving with a ship full of horror, they would sometimes be executed by Imperial authorities, who saw only traitor-tainted personnel. Other times, they were quietly absorbed into penal colonies, their pasts erased because acknowledging their existence raised questions the Imperium preferred not to address. A handful of Thralls found ways to escape during the chaos. When their ship docked at a contested world, or when internal fighting among the Night Lords created opportunities, some managed to slip away. These escapes were rarely clean. Thralls carried nothing. No identification, no resources, no explanation for where they had been or what they had done. They became ghosts, drifting through Imperial space under false identities, always watching for signs that their past had caught up with them. The Night Lords themselves largely forgot about individual Thralls. For the Astartes, mortal serfs were interchangeable. One technician died, another was acquired. One Medici thrall broke psychologically, they were replaced. The Legion's chronicles, such as they were, made no mention of the thousands of humans who had maintained their ships, prepared their weapons, enabled their terror campaigns. From the 8 Legion's perspective, Thralls were background, barely worth remembering. But the Thralls themselves carried the memories. Even decades later, former Night Lord serfs would wake with nightmares of what they had seen or done. They would hear screaming in silent moments, hallucinations. Born from too many hours spent near torture chambers, they would flinch at sudden movements, expecting violence. They would isolate themselves because ordinary human interaction felt alien after years of survival-focused relationships. The physical escape from the Night Lords was possible, however rarely achieved. The psychological escape never was. 10,000 years after the heresy, the Night Lords continue operating as pirate war bands, raiding from the eastern fringe and the maelstrom. They still require thralls. The same dynamics persist. Worlds are raided, survivors are captured, some are selected for service. The current generation of thralls endures the same conditions as their predecessors. The same violence, the same impossible choices, the same slow grinding away of humanity through systematic terror. The Imperium doesn't acknowledge these people. They exist in a category that Imperial doctrine struggles to address. Not quite traitors, since they serve under duress, but not quite victims, since their labor enables atrocities. On the rare occasions when Imperial forces rescue thralls from Night Lords' vessels, the individuals are typically executed or mind-wiped. The Administratum prefers simple categories: loyal or traitor. Thralls fit neither cleanly, so they are eliminated. This erasure extends to historical records. The chronicles of the heresy mention thralls occasionally, brief references to ship crews or support personnel, but never with detail or depth. They are furniture in the narrative, background elements that enabled the primary actors. Even Imperial scholars studying the traitor legions focus on the Astartes themselves, their strategies and motivations, and eventual corruption. The mortals who made those strategies possible are beneath notice. Yet without those mortals, the Night Lords could not have functioned. Without technicians, their ships would have failed. Without Medici, even Astartes' physiology needs some medical support after severe trauma. Without laborers to maintain basic life support and food systems, the vessels would have become uninhabitable. The 8 Legions' capacity to conduct terror campaigns across decades depended entirely on having a population of skilled workers maintaining their infrastructure. This dependency was never acknowledged by the Night Lords themselves, who viewed thralls as tools beneath their notice. Konrad Kurze built his legion on the philosophy that fear was the ultimate tool of governance, that sufficient terror could maintain order without loyalty. His thralls were proof of concept, people forced through systematic horror to cooperate in their own oppression. But they were also evidence of the philosophy's limitation. Cooperation born from terror is never complete. It includes silent resistance, minor sabotage, the internal preservation of selves that remain separate from the role being performed. The Night Lords controlled their thralls' actions, but never their minds. In the end, the thralls remain the forgotten victims of a forgotten legion. They weren't heroes. They weren't even proper villains. Their complicity was coerced rather than chosen. They were people caught in circumstances that permitted no good options, who made impossible choices in hopes of surviving one more day. They enabled evil through their labor, but were also its victims. They suffered alongside those the Night Lords tortured, but could never claim equal victimhood because their suffering included participation. History has no place for people in such positions, so it erases them. But erasure doesn't change what happened or what they endured. Someone prepared those flaying chambers. Someone cleaned the blood from the deck plating. Someone maintained the systems that kept the ships operational as they traveled from atrocity to atrocity. Those someones had names, lives, fears, hopes that were systematically crushed beneath the weight of service to the most brutal legion humanity ever created. They deserve to be remembered, not for their choices, but for their suffering, not for their actions, but for their humanity in circumstances designed specifically to destroy it.